Hello, folks. Good evening. My name is Alice Hutchinson, and I'm the owner of Birds Books, an independent bookstore in Bethel, Connecticut, and I'm honored to be the host of Write America. The aim of this series is to help set the country back on a correct, productive course of freedom, justice, equality, and plain human kindness. Write America is a literary series created by author Roger Rosenblatt, featuring award-winning, nationally renowned authors and new and emerging writers in readings and conversations each week about how books and art might bridge the deep divisions in our nation. Write America celebrates the quiet power of art in our lives, the unifying power of the highest uses of language. In novels, stories, essays, and poems, we recognize one another as parts of the human family, one family. Roger Rosenblatt, the creator of Write America, puts it this way: writing makes justice desirable, evil intelligible, grief endurable, and love possible. So with that, I welcome you as several of the most beloved and distinguished writers in the country read from their works and talk to each other and with you in an effort to bring us together. We will wind up this spectacular 2-year run at the end of this month. A reminder, the last 3 episodes are on Tuesdays. Next week, the week after, and the 31st. So it's the 17th, 24th, and 31st, I believe, Tuesday nights. If you missed our last episode with Francine Prose and Billy Collins, you can go to Birds Books Write America page and link to the episode easily. All of our recordings are now on Write America's YouTube channel for you to watch at any time. Tonight's episode will also be recorded, and if you missed something, you can go back there and rewatch. Tonight, we're hosting readings by and conversations with Paisley Rekdal and Carlos Fonseca. I will return at the end after the readings and discussion to bring your questions and comments to the authors. During the episode, please feel free to make comments or ask questions in the chat. We do ask that you remain muted, however. Our first speaker is Paisley Rekdal, former poet laureate of Utah. Paisley is the author of 4 works of nonfiction, including Appropriate, A Provocation, and 6 collections of poetry, most recently Nightingale, which won the 2020 Washington State Book Award for Poetry. She is the recipient of fellowships, grants, and prizes from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Guggenheim Foundation, Pushcart Press, and the Academy of American Poets, among others. A Seattle native, Rekdal received her MA in Medieval Studies from the University of Toronto and an MFA, from the University of Michigan. Her work reflects her academic background and its frequent exploration and engagement with historical events that propel future narratives and identity politics that shape her life as an Asian American woman. She is a distinguished professor at the University of Utah, where she is also the creator and editor of community web projects Mapping Literary Utah and Mapping Salt Lake City. Her newest book, West, a translation, comes out May of this year. Please welcome to the screen, Paisley Rekdal. Let me just get you up here. I'm going to add your spotlight. I'm also going to add you as a co-host.
Great, because I'm going to be reading a poem, a digital poem, and it's sort of an interactive reading where I'm going to show you how the website works, and I'll play a couple of videos and then you'll tell me where you would like to go. So let me quickly share my screen. So, all right, why am I not seeing this? I need to see this myself. Why can I not see? Oh, wait, here we go. I am screen sharing supposedly. Oh, there we go. Whoops. All right. So this is West, a translation. I was asked to write a poem about the Transcontinental Railroad. And being half Chinese, I said I would very delightedly write a poem about the Transcontinental Railroad. But I wanted to do it thinking about linking to disparate events. Obviously, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, which took place about 100 miles away from my own house in Utah, and also the Chinese Exclusion Act, which took place 13 years after the Transcontinental was completed. During the building of the Transcontinental, the Chinese were eagerly recruited After the transcontinental was completed, the Chinese were basically banned from the country. The Chinese Exclusion Act was passed as a national law. It was the first act that targeted a specific ethnic or racial group from entering the country, and it lasted until 1943, I believe. My own family, being West Coast Chinese Americans, was also affected by this. What I do is I take a poem that was carved into the walls of Angel Island Immigration Station. This is a poem, you'll hear it in Cantonese, and then I'll show you how the poem opens up into other poems. This poem was carved by an anonymous writer elegizing a fellow detainee who committed suicide in Angel Island during his detention. It's part of a dialogic pair of poems. The two poems basically were, the closest we have in English is a sonnet. These are sort of two regulated verse short poems that face each other in the walls of Angel Island. They take on the same tropes, the same rhyme schemes, and of course the same elegiac subject matter as they elegize this suicide. So I'm going to, that's all the information on the poem. So the first thing I'm going to do is play for you the opening video, hear the poem, and then I'll let you know what we can watch.
Curated art penanita.
聽到火車嘅聲音，
Δεν είμαστε επιβάτες στο τρένο
Questo
εμείς.
è il suo
汽笛が聞こえてくる。
Του καβαλάρι
それは
μας.
私たちの重荷となり、
No podemos
今までの
portar
計り知れない人々の汗、
聽到火車嘅
涙、
聲音。
避難を
Nos
逃れて、
avances
This is the sound of a train.
No viajamos en el tren.
Αυτός
Είναι ο ήχος ενός
We
τρένου.
cannot ride on the railroad. Non riusciamo a guidare
we
sti tipi.
cannot nishibike
聽到火車嘅聲音，
ajo nasli.
噩耗傳聞實可哀，吊君何日果思回？無能冥目憑誰訴？有失應知悔此來。千古含愁千古恨，思鄉空對望鄉台。未酬壯志迷壤土，知以雄心死不悔。
And now you can go to the poem. And every character or pair of characters in that poem opens up into a different poem of the railroad. Some are video poems and some are not. So I'll play you an example of one, and then I'll yell out a few options, and you can tell me what you would like to hear or know about the transcontinental. The rest of these will have closed captioning.
What day? On this 7th day of the 7th month, magpies bridge in a cluster of black and white. The Sky King crosses to meet his queen, time tracked by the close-knit wheeling of stars. I watch. You come to me tonight, drunk on wine and cards, nails ridged black with opium to ease the pain of work. We are all men here. Anybody can be a bridge, little raven. Your eyes squeezed shut, but not from pain. We are a trestle, a grade we build together. What matter if you say you'd never choose me? Were there women willing in this desert? I chose. I choose the memory we share of rivers, your hair of smoke and raw, wet leather. A man in another man's hand makes himself tool or weapon, says the overseer, as if a man's use to another is only one of work. Pleasure is the only chosen future. You are the home I briefly make, the country I can return to. Here, where the moon wheels its white shoulder in the dark, and you push me to the earth, slip my whiskered tip of hair into your mouth.
So because this project is insane, it actually is a book, and it's going to come with a whole series of mini lyric essays. Each poem comes with a lyric note that is an essay on history. All the essays together compose one long essay. But I'll read you the note for what day, and then I'll just play some videos or other things. There's some other documentary poems. So this is the note on what day. Canadian filmmaker Richard Fung opens Dirty Laundry, a history of heroes, with the scene of a train steward reading a magazine article headlined Canada's Railway, a symbol under threat. A few shots later, this same steward is locked in an embrace with a journalist named Roger Kwong, who's traveling across the Canadian Rockies to research his family's history with the train. The two men's encounter is interspersed with historical footage of the train hurtling through tunnels, the train moving both backward and forward at once, the men's sex overlaid on the technology Kwong's family helped build. Is the train, in its disruption of time, where we lose or find ourselves? My father recalls traveling back to Seattle from his East Coast college on the Transcontinental, during which time he shared a car with the young child and her mother. One night he woke to find the child crying, the mother gone. When he went in search of her, he found the woman in a darkened corridor, skirt hiked up, legs wrapped around another passenger. It changed my picture of women forever, my father said, disgusted. I laughed. Move your hands into the dugout dirt. You can feel the nestle of bodies, the soft silt of skin and hair. Translation of a man into labor. Translation of a man into need. And what is that translation? Humiliation or rage or desire. We never stop building the railroad. So the subjects I chose to cover, I try to cover as many as possible. I talk about African-American porters. I talk about immigration policy, obviously LGBTQ lives, hobos, Hollywood, gender roles on trains, racial mixing on trains. I talk about Chinese death rituals. I talk about war. I talk about photography. So if there's anything in particular you'd like me to read at some point, you could throw it in the chat. But we don't have a ton of time, so I'm going to show you some of these other things that I've done. So some of them are videos, and some of them are actually just documents that I placed on the site as well. So this is a contrapuntal poem. And one of the things that I was really struck by was how, of course, there were a lot of interesting parallels between when the Transcontinental was being built and when I was writing the poem. And one was the fact that Andrew Johnson was president around that time, and he was impeached. And of course, while I was writing the poem during 2018, 2019, we also went through impeachment. So this is about Andrew Johnson's Swing Around the Circle train tour, which was a disastrous train tour. And I was interested in the speeches he gave. And so I'm going to read each side separately because none of this language is mine. You'll recognize where some of this language comes from, and then I'll read how the poem could be read together. So this is the epigraph. If he would stay in the White House, keep his mouth shut and not make a fool of himself, disgusting friend and foe alike, the President of the United States might command some respect. Potter County Journal, 1866, on Andrew Johnson's Swing Around the Circle train tour. And this is Johnson's side. At this particular crisis of the American people, I cling to the Constitution, notwithstanding a mendacious press, that common gang of cormorants and bloodsuckers, the pains Congress has taken to malign what all patriotic men should rally round. There is no power that can control me. Before I would see this government destroyed, I would send every Negro back to Africa. I will indeed be your Moses. There are a good many people, but this is a country for white men, hence you can see why I have been assaulted. I hand over to you this flag, though imprisoned. I feel confident you agree to the same great doctrine, if these are your tender mercies, God. And you'll recognize the other person. We have shattered the mentality, the broken promises, jobless recoveries, tired platitudes. Nobody has done anything like I've been able to do. I alone can fix that strong border. They want a wall, that Chinese virus, I call it, because when somebody is president of the United States, that authority is total to silence your voices on social media. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crimes, sad. And then you get into legal semantics on both sides. So we had a campaign. Sorry, women, thank you for that big victory. It's called Total Acquittal, and now I am your voice. I view everybody as a threat except for possibly Abe Lincoln. Trust me, there will be no lies. And this is the poem in its entirety. At this particular crisis, we have shattered the mentality of the American people. I cling to the Constitution, the broken promises, jobless recoveries, tired platitudes. Notwithstanding a mendacious press, nobody has done anything like I've been able to do. That common gang of cormorants and bloodsuckers, I alone can fix the pains Congress has taken to malign that strong border. They want a wall, what all patriotic men should rally round. That Chinese virus, I call it, because there is no power that can control me. When somebody is president of the United States, that authority is total. Before I would see this government destroyed to silence your voices on social media, I would send every Negro back to Africa. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crimes. Sad. I will indeed be your Moses. And then you get into legal semantics. There are a good many people on both sides. So we had a campaign, but this is a country for white men. Sorry, women. Thank you for that big victory. Hence, you can see why I've been assaulted. It's called Total Acquittal. And now I hand over to you this flag. Though imprisoned, I am your voice. I view everybody as a threat. I feel confident you agree to the same great doctrine, except for possibly Abe Lincoln. If these are your tender mercies, God, trust me, there will be no lies. And I know we only have like a couple more minutes left, so I'm gonna just start with, end with something else. Thanks. Wow. I know, I think about wow all the time when I was writing this project. I'm gonna leave with something funny. So I will lead with this one. Let me see. Sorry. For some reason, I cannot do everything on this easily.
Heroic. Helen Holmes, The Hazards of Helen. Victim? Tie me up to Tressler Bridge, I bristle, buck, saw through blunt bindings, swing and shimmy to ease myself down burnished poles. Bold, cold, heroic. Lock me inside your clerk's closet, I'll pick its double lock. Duck the huckster's ill-timed shot, tackle robbers in the boxcar. Intrepid, I ride astride slender waist rails, uncouple cars, and mount runaways. I turn all tails to heads, begin each film fired, despised, till I solve all crises I alone saw coming. I get my men. My fans are manifests now of different destinies. The West is a dead end for those with frailty inbuilt to their machinery. Men here hit the skids, lost it all on stocks, cows, cards, slots, topped out and constrained by history. But I'm still speculative, exciting, my amplitude the endless futurity to which my sex has always been traveling. That's why strangers eat me up in the dark, laugh when I grab the robber's mitt, the one snatching at your heartstrings, my leather believes. Now I bring my mouth down to his wrist to take a bite that only looks like a kiss.
And then I don't have time to read the essays on this one exactly. So hopefully I will get this to go down there. Okay. So I'll just play the translation and then you'll sort of know, generally speaking, how it goes. And
We cannot count all the dead.
This is the sound of a train.
Δεν είμαστε επιβάτες στο τρένο εμείς.
指摘が聞こえてくる。
που καβαλάει.
それは私たちの重荷となり、
Podemos
今までの
portar
人々の
This is the sound of a train.
This is the sound of a train.
ενώ βιαχάμε.
So this is the sound of a train.
Αυτός είναι ο ήχος ενός
You
τρένου.
cannot ride on the railroad country.
And I'll just exit so you can see the translation, but basically the website is actually up now, so you can play with it. You can share it with people. I want people to know as much as possible about the history of the Transcontinental Railroad. And this is just obviously just a tiny, tiny slice of what's on there. And the book, which is coming out May 2nd, has that massive essay that actually goes into far more historical detail and thinking about basically the cultural impact of the railroad on America and its long-lasting effects. Because there's really not one part of America that the train did not change in a fundamental way. So anyway, that is it. And I turn it over to Carlos. Let me stop share. Oh, I'll put the site in the chat.
Wow, that was amazing. Thank you, Paisley. Our next speaker is Carlos Fonseca. Carlos Fonseca was born in 1987 in San Jose, Costa Rica, and spent half of his childhood and adolescence in Puerto Rico. In 2016, he was named one of the 20 best Latin American writers born in the 1980s at the Guadalajara Book Fair, and in 2017, he was included in the Bogota 39 list of the best Latin American writers under 40. He is the author of the novel Coronel Lagrimas, Restless Books 2016, and Natural History. And in 2018, he won the National Prize for Literature in Costa Rica for his book of essays, La Lucida del Meope. His latest book, Austral, will be published in May of 2023. He teaches at Trinity College, Cambridge, and lives in London, which is where he's joining us from. Thank you, Carlos. Let me add you up here.
Thanks so much, Alice, and thanks so much, Paisley, for that amazing. I declare myself an absolute fan. I'm definitely gonna go and see the website, and I recognize myself in so much of what you're doing, right, and so much of what you were saying when you were talking about history and what do we do with these voices that we inherit, right? Those two clips that you showed at the beginning and at the end, where we are kind of trying to make sense of those almost private languages, but that somehow are in communication, in translation, trying to achieve something together. I was thinking about that in relationship to my own work, which indirectly leads or works with questions of history as well. But there was a crucial word that you mentioned that got me thinking, which was the future, right? And I think that nowadays in our debates we run the risk of just being sometimes too apocalyptic, and we just keep talking about ends and ends and ends without thinking about the possibility of futures. And I think one of the things that literature can do, and a project like yours is definitely trying to do, is trying to point towards the future, right? And I think literature has that possibility of working with legacies, working with inheritance, and trying to bridge the past and the future. So I'm gonna do something that's gonna be terribly old-fashioned after what you did, Paisley. So I'm just gonna be doing old-fashioned readings from the previous novel I published in translation, which is Natural History. And then I'm also gonna be reading from Austral, the new novel that is coming out in translation in a couple months. I think end of May with FSG. So first of all, I want to say also thanks so much to Alice and Bird's Book for the invitation, and to Roger. Write America it's beautiful, the project, and I have been lucky to have been with you guys for a couple of times. So thanks so much for that. Good. So the first excerpt, which has to do with the question of legacy and inheritance, comes from Natural History, which is this little book here, which, thanks to Megan McDowell, was translated into English from the original Spanish in 2000, and it was the pandemic year, so 2020. That's a good way of remembering it. And I'm just gonna read a brief excerpt in which the relationship between a family, and I'm just gonna read a brief excerpt in which the daughter indirectly kind of like thinks of like her own kind of like life and what's going to remain there once she like passes away, because she's suffering from an illness. So I'll just go ahead and read. I'm tired of wheels, doctors, and so much funeral red tape that only returns me to the image of my own death. Maybe that's why in my few free moments, I shut myself in my studio where no one dares to disturb me. And I prepare the papers I plan to send you one day. I don't say anything to anyone, and I come here to feed the fish, to listen to a music that's pale as the night, and to prepare this file. This is our project just as we imagined it years ago, reflected in a future we'll no longer be a part of. It will be your small inheritance. But tell me, what is an inheritance? I, who believe myself an orphan, who changed my name to lose a family whose history I didn't understand, today I inexorably return to that family. I never told you, but that night when you came to my house and saw the medical envelope on the table, a man had just told me that something inside me was preparing to betray me. That afternoon, I chose not to tell you, even though I could see how you were looking at the envelope and your face gave away your discovery. I chose not to tell you what I had heard that day, the story of the genetic mutation, the illness that was preparing to eat away at me, the long road ahead. I, who believe myself an orphan, who changed my name to lose a family whose story I didn't understand, didn't want to tell you my inheritance was returning in the form of a mutating gene, a gene that was turning into something else, something lethal that now seemed determined to annihilate me. Ironies of life. Eternal inheritance, I said to myself then, was an incurable illness that one day leaves us terribly tired, contemplating a pile of papers that described an unfinished project. After you left that night, I thought about my parents again, and I started to organize that posthumous project of which you are now a part. No one chooses their inheritance. More than once, I thought about telling you everything, leaving the pieces fitted together, the puzzle complete, the intrigue resolved. Then I understood that if I did, you would never come to understand me as I am. You would lose focus on my story if I didn't force you to relive it. Just as I had lost focus on the inheritance whose echo was now invading me from inside, transforming my body into an enormous theater of death. Perhaps that's why, tired as I am, I'm sitting here to write this letter that I know full well I'll never send you, aware as I am that it's always best to leave the image half assembled. Like that final night when you came over and I didn't want to talk. We just sat down to put together a boring puzzle, and halfway through, sorrowful at saying goodbye, I pretended to fall asleep. And I watched you struggle with the pieces, knowing you wouldn't find the image you wanted there, only the banality of a lake covered in flowers. That night, I realized you would know how to navigate your inheritance as I had struggled to navigate mine. My inheritance, which today is forcing me to sign state papers with a name that isn't even my real one, aware that my body's mutating and betraying me. Aware also that this letter will not reach you and that somehow you will have to intuit it for yourself. Inheritance is a bit like that, a letter written from the past that never reaches the present, and your task is to reconstruct that absent conversation. So Paisley, as I was hearing you and you showing us the original video of all of the voices, I felt like that idea of a letter written from the past that never reaches the present, and the task of the poet to being like that of indirectly kind of establishing or rebuilding or piecing together that conversation that is of course a conversation that is in translation indirectly, right? So I was thinking about that. And I was thinking that indirectly also ties to the project of or the new novel, because in the new novel it's again a family story, but in this case it's a woman who indirectly kind of goes back to her past and finds the story of her father, who was an anthropologist who inherited a project from another anthropologist who was trying to save basically a language from extinction, or was in the project of recording the words of a last native speaker And that question of like, what does that mean for culture, and in what ways like there like a language is something, but that language also is like recorded and kind of moves into the future, right? Like the recordings indirectly that you were showing. So I'll just read a very brief passage from this novel, which is entitled Austral, also translated by my beloved Megan McDowell, and I'll just read. My father thought his trip to the Sir Mad Sanitarium followed a mere whim, the temptation to hear the last words of a man who had once been a genius, but who had now seemed doomed to disappear into the labyrinths of madness. Perhaps that's why he didn't know how to react when, on the third day, he found that the chessboard had been replaced by a tape recorder. True to his British manners, he didn't comment on the change in routine. He merely watched as von Mühlfeld reached out his hand, sheathed in a white glove, and pressed the button that started up what he would later describe as the theater of a voice doing battle with history. A rough and hoary voice that alternated very soberly between words in Spanish and what seemed to be vocables in a remote language. Von Mühlfeld would later clarify the name and provenance of this dialect, but its remoteness and magic must have inspired in my father the same sense of anxiety and distance that struck the first man who stood before Edison's invention, the thrill of confronting a spectral object light and fantastical, an apparatus in sum able to conjure the voices of the past and the dead. Perhaps that was the experience he tried to record hours later in his diary in two isolated phrases that were like lines of poetry. The theater of a voice doing battle with history, the silences of a language doing battle with equilibrium. Perhaps he understood then the reason Karl-Heinz von Mühlfeld had brought him there was not exactly the one he had imagined. It wasn't the chronicle of New Germany that concerned him, but something else. It was a story that emerged in the middle of that afternoon with the monotony of those slowly spinning magnetic tapes, while around them in a spiral stretched the voice of a man who was patiently trying to inscribe on the air the memory of a language only he could understand. Later, my father would write in his diaries, more than the voice, what impressed me were the silences, the pauses, the lapses when nothing much happened, but you could sense the hesitations of a man lost in a pursuit as titanic as it was useless. The same pursuit that von Mühlfeld decided to delegate to my father as soon as he realized his own energy wouldn't suffice. They let the recording run until the end, when the words finally ceased and there were only a floating voice that said, Juvenal Suarez Dictionary, 1965. Juvenal Suarez was the youngest of a family of 5 brothers, the last of whom he had seen fall prey to the fevers of measles. Moon Teva, he heard his brothers say, and watched him dissipate just like that, the way flowers or clouds disappear. At that time, there were fewer than 15 members of the Nataibo tribe, and only Juvenal seemed to understand that the words held a sad prophecy. A few weeks earlier, an expedition of garimpeiros in search of gold had stumbled upon their Amazon village, and from that moment on, the native population had fallen ill at an alarming rate. Moon Tewa, his brother had said, proud that none of the garimpeiros could understand what his words meant. They were words that Juvenal Suarez would translate 2 years later from von Mühlfeld as, this is as far as we come. Speaking a brittle Spanish he had learned years before from the robber tappers whose arrival had marked the beginning of the end for the Nataibo people. So that's just like 2 kind of like brief episodes from the old novel and the new novel that I felt like have a lot of like resonance with like your work, basically.
They do, I guess. Do I? Okay, there we go. Yeah, no, in a weird way, I think we were perfectly paired. I was saying right before we started, I was actually accidentally, I didn't realize I was going to be reading and speaking with you. And so I actually bought this book a year ago and I was reading it again because I'm teaching a class on archival imaginations, basically. And so I was like, this would be, kind of right up my alley. And so I wanted to ask you about translation and archives, basically, like how they seem to work together. Because as I'm reading this, they feel like they kind of go hand in hand. And I'm wondering if you want to say anything about that, because I have theories myself, but what are you thinking?
So you see, this is the type of stuff that, like, kind of points that we are working definitely in the same stuff, because I also teach in like the university, and like one of the kind of like projects that or one of the classes that I teach is like archival fictions, right?
Oh,
And
yes.
you see, like,
Oh my gosh, we're the same person. We're even
exactly.
white shirts. It's really kind of disturbing now that I think about it.
So I think like like we're both readers of WGC, about like this is what we were talking before, and like there's a question of like how do you go back to the archive and like take that archive that in the case of America, which we're talking about here, is a very fractured archive, archive like full of like silences, invisibilities, erasure, and kind of like piece it together, right? Like like Sebald thought of it in terms of ruins, and I think like for us nowadays the question is like, or something that I have been thinking about, is how not just to like fall prey of like the melancholia that the ruins always come with, and that it's very pleasurable sometimes, but like there has to be like a moment in which that melancholia leads to a future, and a future that indirectly kind of pieces together all of those like bits and pieces that always run the risk of becoming like almost private languages, which was what like interested me also of like that first clip and the last clip that you showed, which were like, oh my goodness, like these are people like almost trapped in private languages, but at the same time doing the very highly political like impulse of trying to then bridge those private languages into one another.
I'm so glad you said that you're looking for something beyond melancholia from the archive, because when starting off with my students today and talking about sort of the way that we've imagined the archive theoretically, it is Derrida thinks of it as a place of death. It's a death drive. Baudrillard also thinks about like the museum as a place of death, and it's about fragmentation and loss, and you can't have these things without death. But that also negates, I think, the fact that we're both writers that are obsessed with archives in some ways, or the idea of history, that there is something pleasurable about going into an archive, and there is something about the idea of a possible future. I was thinking about Cristina Rivera Garza's work, where she talks about like disappropriation and the possibilities that the archive actually gives us, to go in there and think about these different voices in conversation, and that's not necessarily a loss. And so, I thought about that too a lot with my project, because the transcontinental, like all of those documents, some of them are real and some become imagined, because there are definitely people, like the LGBTQ experience on the railroad, for example, is not one that gets written out a lot. And when I was thinking about initially writing about the Chinese experience of the railroad, I thought, oh, this will be fun. I'll just go into an archive and find those letters and diary entries and oral histories. And there's nothing. They've never found a single document written by a Chinese worker. So I thought about that, and I was like, well, what do I do? I mean, I'm gonna have to make all of this up. But then I started reading these 19th century phrase books for Chinese workers coming to the United States. And, they were remarkably candid about what they were experiencing. Like they were, as you were saying, like really trying to speak across these lines. So even though they were phrase books that you would buy so that you could get a job, or you could, get a meal, there were whole sections on dealing with the police, sentences like, this man died from suicide, that man tried to kill me, that man took all my money, that man squatted on my mind, that, and suddenly you're like, oh, they are speaking across time and history. And it's not that they were rendered voiceless at all. It's just that you have to know where to listen. And I was so interested in that. But that question of like, what is the positive, what is the hope that the archive offers? And I'll just say one last thing. I mean, I thought a lot about, for just the book, there's two visual images, and as a Sebald person, you'll appreciate this. There's two big images that really guide the movement of the book. One is actually that that image that opens the transcontinental poem that I played, which is that famous champagne photo where they're reaching across, shaking hands, and all the workers are there supposedly. And if you look at it visually, it comprises an X, and the X marks a spot. X is modernity, X is completion, X is the future. But about 50 miles away is the spiral jetty. It's just like Robert Smithson did. And his whole argument about history and everything is it's all entropy and it spirals backwards. And so my big question for this was like, are we as Americans, are we moving forward or are we moving backwards? Or are we doing this simultaneously? And probably the answer is we're doing it simultaneously. We're jogging forward and we're jogging backwards. But I'm kind of curious, like, how you see hope. Like, what do you think hope from the archive looks like? What does the archive give us that can give us future or futurity?
Yeah, it's a hard question, but like, hearing you speak, like, before you were saying, like, the archive has often been thought of like in terms of like spectrality, like, death and like melancholia. Whereas, as you say, like, the archive also posits the possibility of survival, right? Or like, or kind of like, going beyond like the traditional ways in which we think of like the end, right? Or like death, and like opening like a space of like a space of futurity. And one of the things that like it's not going to answer directly your question, but that is interesting for me in terms of futurity is even like what this question of like what would it mean to narrate the archive or like to like give voice to the archive does to literature and to the future of literature. Because I was like, when I was seeing the website that you have made, one of the things that interested me was like, wow, like, this is where like this question of narrating the archive is leading us to these amazing hybrid new forms that like are kind of like pushing the way of like how we understand literature and even historical writing forward, right? So before we mentioned W.G. Sebald, and like W.G. Sebald was already kind of like, he was led into this hybrid sort of like narrative, like historical, photographic narratives by the question of like narrating the archive. And you mentioned like one of the people that like, not only do I consider a friend, but like one of my biggest kind of like influences, which is Rivera Garza, who I absolutely adore. And it's very interesting how in her work, like the question of her, as a historian, like how to narrate the archive led her to these very interesting hybrid forms, like, that bridge somehow also poetry, fiction, narrative fiction, essay writing, like reappropriation, creative reappropriation of voices, right? And it's interesting for me that it's not only like thinking about the future of history, but also about the future of literature in this case.
So tell her how much she meant to me, because I mean, she really helped me so much with the book and just with the project and thinking about this, because one of the things, as you're speaking, I was thinking about hope again, and one of Garza's arguments is sort of around labor and the archive and voices, and sort of like, well, when we're thinking about literature, I think we have this sort of fundamentally still romantic idea that it's like one artist in a room creating a book, and her point is like, once you get into that archive, in some ways, like everybody is creating that book. The authorship is shared in some really powerful ways. And there's also like a nice little kind of Marxist dig at us, which is sort of like, who makes writing for you possible? Like, who is the person you've hired to clean your house or take care of your kids? Like, they're writing your book too. And but I did think about this question of futurity and elegy, I think, with this project a lot, because, when we think of elegy, going back to that word melancholia, we might think of elegy as something that's like melancholic, which is just constantly mourning. But I was watching, it was like a YouTube video that Stanford University was doing, it was like a big transcontinental conversation, symposium. And a woman in the audience asked if the Chinese and Native Americans had any contact. And I thought it was very interesting. A lot of them were like, on the stage, they said, no, not really. But then someone said, I think that there's this this footnote in this one article. So I tracked down the article, and the footnote led to something really fascinating, which was that, you know, going again back to this idea that the Chinese had no record or left no record. A number of Chinese workers seem to have intermarried with the Shoshone or the Paiute. And there's a story about one man, I can't remember his name, Sam Long or something like that, who became fluent in Ute and ended up memorizing all of the stories that were important to the Utes that he had learned. And when he died, I think like 60 Paiute elders went to mourn him at the Indian agent's office in Cheyenne. And I was really struck by like the idea that cultural memory, you know, again, there's a certain other kind of bodily archive that happens through, you know, oral history testimony. So it doesn't exist in paper, but exists in these other testimonies that then get transferred to paper. And that's kind of the weird hope. And I think that's the weird beauty of sharing these voices too, across time and across culture, which is that to a certain extent, that kind of memory becomes communally owned and communally sustained. And it's not melancholic at all. It's actually like this song of endurance over time, which I really loved. But
yeah, no, and that definitely like links to like Austral, like the new novel, because like one of the things that I was interested there, I remember reading like, I think it was an essay book by Daniel Heller Rosen, a very nice essayist. And he had like this phrase that like struck me within that essay, which was like, in a passage from one culture to another, something always survives or subsists, even if nobody's there to like witness it or to remain a part of. And that was one of the interesting things that I was trying to like, you know, explore, like how is that notion of survival beyond the traditional like ways of like, you know, the written records or something like that, like a way of exploring like, you know, the futurity of like cultures that like otherwise fall victim to like, you know, kind of discourses, apocalyptic discourses of the end that are just like too intense. The other thing that I was thinking about when you were speaking just now was how is it that the archive opens us to voices of the other, right? I think right now we're in a moment in which like, with regards to these whole debates regarding cultural appropriation and so on, there's always the danger, right? Or there's the question of like, how then would we relate to the voices of the other, right? Without appropriating in the problematic sense. But there's also always the danger of like them saying, okay, so then if I cannot access the voice of the other, I'm only gonna narrate from my own experience. And then that of course leads to the possibility of like some sort of like autofictional like solipsism that would be the opposite of politics, right? So the question now is how to like, you know, very ethically find a space where there is like a confluence between my voice and the voice of the other that is not like kind of mediated by power relations in the classical way, or that at least is conscious. And that's an interesting space that I think the archive makes possible.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up, because my last book was actually all about cultural appropriation in literature. So the grand irony is, after I write a book called Appropriate, a provocation, all about like the nuances and the difficulties of appropriation in literature, and the positives too, that I would be cursed with like then writing a poem that is entirely appropriative, where I'm literally going into archives and taking, you know, language, whether, you know, looking at Sad, the poem of the two presidents, language, we may not be upset about that kind of appropriation because of a different kind of power dynamic that works in my direction. But I use the language, I use the oral history archives of African-American porters who are part of A. Philip Randolph's union in the mid-20th century. And so I'm using specifically their voices. And so I did have to think very hard and long about what does it mean to do this, and you know, how do I preserve the rhythm and the power of their voices without overwriting it to make it sound like me? So I spent a lot of time thinking about, okay, you know, here's my ethics around it. And one was, you know, no one says anything that they didn't say. That's one easy one. But another one is to sort of say, like, how do you preserve some of the dialectical ticks that I think add to meaning and aren't there to sort of to showcase class or racial otherness, right? Because I think sometimes when I've heard poems that do that kind of work, there's something about it sort of like, I'm choosing this voice because I think it sounds folksy and kind of cute, or it sounds different to me, and so it sounds poetic. But for me, a lot of the men that whose testimonies I was using, they were using repetition in a very particular way that I thought added to a greater meaning, a greater kind of relationship with the interviewer that was revelatory, and a greater repetition or sense of like how violence itself was constantly filtering through their lives. And so I was like, those repetitions have to be there to highlight something about how they saw themselves and how they knew they were being seen versus how I wanted them to perform a poetic, if that makes sense. But I don't know. I'm sure a lot of people will read those and go, oh my God, still not her voice. But I would have to say that I think, one of the positives of appropriation in general goes back to something you've been saying about politics. It's almost impossible to gain political traction if you can't see your cause as allied with other people's causes. And I think when I go back to the history of the transcontinental, one thing that comes back over and over and over is that some of the protests that the Chinese were engaged in would have worked much better if they worked across racial and cultural lines. And it was the refusal to see what they had in common that in fact doomed some people to failure. Yeah.
No, definitely. Like, for example, when I was hearing the clip with the voices, because I'm a native Spanish speaker, indirectly, I was immediately like, linked to the Spanish voice. And I also like, it had a particular tonality that sounded even like a little bit like me speaking Spanish. I was like, I was quite like directed to it. And it like linked immediately mentally to all of the struggles of, the wall. Eventually you led there. And it was, when Trump was saying, no, we'll get them to build it themselves and stuff like that, it was, and that's an interesting space, a space of commonality, of like common struggles that I think has, if everybody just then like goes in their own kind of like private little worlds, then like, there's no possibility of like a politics, and from that fragmentation, then like the different communities are much like weaker as well.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that was something that really sort of did surprise me, like doing the research for this. I mean, I saw how oftentimes Chinese, not railroad workers, but other sort of Chinese immigrants to the country would create an immediate triangulation between their experience, African Americans and white people, and then try to like ally themselves with white people, so that that there was a way in which they were like, well, we're whatever we aren't slaves, and we're not like black people, we're not like this and stuff like that. And it was sad to see that. It was frustrating. You can see exactly how we've gotten here. And again, it goes back to that root of this sort of siloing, the refusal to see commonality, the refusal to see humanity. And the Chinese were, victims of that, and they were also perpetrators of that. And I found that, an awful and sort of resonant and sort of continuing problem, I think, in our country. But we're back to, my dog is here. So, hey, dog.
Hi, dog. You guys could go on forever. Do you want to keep going?
It's midnight for you, Carlos.
That's true. I keep forgetting the time zone that you're living in. I do want to ask 2 questions that I ask everyone who's on Right America. The first one is, in your experience, do you know someone who's in need of a shout out, who is either a student or a colleague that has work that we might not have run across? Can you share someone that you can put on our radar?
Paisley, you want to go first?
Oh, shoot.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to leave you stalled out. I didn't know I had to call on you.
Yeah, no, I'm pulling this out because so I've got 2. One is a former student of mine. So Adam Weinstein, actually I'll shout out 2 students, Adam Weinstein, who writes, I'm pretty sure, Carlos, you're going to really like his work. And now, of course, the title completely leaves me, but it's like What We Lost in the Ice or something like that. And it's fabulous. And then also another student, Sarah Eliza Johnson, she just came up with another book called Vapor. But this is, there's a poet that I just discovered called Gray Coho. And it's in the Diné Reader. It's an anthology of Navajo literature. I'm the poetry editor for High Country News, and I was interviewing Esther Bellin, who was one of the editors of this. And, you know, this is somebody I'd never heard of in my entire life, and is writing like this really dense, beautiful, like kind of modernist poetry that, you know, and at the same time that modernists were writing, but no one's ever heard of him. So get the Diné Reader and check him out. Some versions of the ice. Thank you very much.
Computers.
Oh yeah, I know. I could have done that work.
Carlos.
I'm going to recommend two authors that have been recently translated from Spanish into English.
Mhm.
So the first one is a wonderful Chilean author, Alia Trabuco Serán, who I think in the US, it was Coffee House Press who like published her. Remainder, translated by the wonderful translator Sophie Hughes. And I think Alia, you know, it's very much like working like similar kind of like things that like Paisley and I are working. She's working with questions of archive, questions of historical memory, but questions of futurity. And I think she has a new novel coming out in translation soon in Spanish. It was called Limpia, which literally would be like clean. I don't know how they're going to translate it, but she's an amazing author. And I also want to give a shout out to a wonderful Argentine author called Hernan Roncino, who a while back, I think like 5 or 6 years ago, got translated by Melville House Press. A wonderful like little like novella called Glaxo. In his case, what is interesting for me is like that capacity to incorporate orality and very different like oral registers into like an amazing kind of like, I don't know, like polyphonic sort of like novels. And I think, you know, as often happens in translation, the novel kind of like didn't catch enough attention, and like they haven't like published him afterwards. But it's one of those authors that I just think like, you know, needs to be out there, needs to be read.
I think we've either had Alia on Write America or tried to get her here. She's a name that we've heard before, and I'm really glad to hear you mention it, because, you know, the more people hear this names, they kind of go, oh, I've heard that name, and are attracted to it. What are you guys reading now? What's on the nightstand?
I'm reading Carlos's novel.
I love that. I think that's so serendipitous. That's just magic.
And the beautiful thing, because I'm also reading Paisley, and the beautiful thing is that like often it sounds like, oh, of course you're gonna say that, but like after this conversation, I think everybody can like, you know, rest assured that there is a reason for it.
That does happen. You know, when you start to learn about somebody's work, you want to get it. So thank you both for enriching us with your work and your discussion. The commonality that you have is just, it's beyond serendipitous. It's always magic when it happens. Well, I hope you all stay in touch.
Definitely.
I'm going to sign off tonight, and I'm going to give a couple of announcements. So I want to thank you both so much for being here tonight. It really has been quite a special evening. Before we sign off, I'd like to read a note from our series creator, Roger Rosenblatt. Dear friends, Russell Banks has died. The obituaries will take account of his brilliance as a novelist. We in Write America know him as a strong friend, brave, clear-minded, and honest about his work and about the world. He saw through this country as he saw into it, the best and the worst, and he wrote with a moral clarity that seemed to shout on the page. When the idea for Write America first hit me, Russell was one of half a dozen beloved colleagues to whom I turned to test its worth. His lifelong friend and editor, Dan Halpern, was another. With Russell's wife, the poet Chase Twitchell, with Dan, and with readers everywhere, we mourn the loss of a great spirit and a great man. Love, Roger. It is with great thanks to Paisley and Carlos for sharing their works and thoughts this evening. I bid you good night till next Tuesday, January 17th. The last 3 episodes are on Tuesdays, as we welcome Priya Jain and Anne Parrott. Parrots, excuse me. Thank you and have a great evening, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.